Thatcher, and also in the SNP. I mean, the SNP has changed a lot over time in terms of its politics, and that's something I think it would just be wrong to try and conceal or to deny that we've come on an awful long way. And all the hook-skirling, Bannockburn rallies, etc. That was a big part of it, and it's significant, I think, that you cannot imagine the Shiel na Gael contemporarily emerging within the Scottish National Party, and a damn good thing too, I'd say.
Yeah, I thought there was strong points and weak points with it. I mean, what you're saying about the kind of arc of time that they're saying, I mean, I understand that's being used as a kind of narrative device, and they've only got three 45-minute documentaries to explain a lot of things, but I'm just not convinced about that timing. I mean, like, the way it was kind of portrayed was that we were all union together and all very happy before that time, and nobody took independence as a serious prospect. Well, think about 1820 or 1919. I mean, there were constantly people against the union, and not just a lunatic fringe, which they actually said, which I thought I wasn't too happy about. And then I thought a lot of the guests were kind of the old dinosaurs that we're used to seeing. I don't think it was particularly imaginative with who they had on. It's just the usual old people. I enjoyed Jimmy Reid on Parkinson, though. I hadn't seen that before. And in the second episode, the totally mad bit about the Bellahouston Park thing with the trees and today it's trees and tomorrow it's Protestants. I was 5 years old and I was at that. I had no idea I was involved in a papist conspiracy. Really,
that's how it starts. That's the point.
The only thing I remember was that it was very hot and there was a helicopter, which I thought was cool. That's still the extent of my religious feeling to this day. But
I think one of the more interesting parts was the way they went into the kind of contortions in the Scottish Labour Party about the questions of home rule and devolution generally throughout, from the 50s up until 1997. I think that's actually one of the stronger parts of the documentary, because I think Andrew mentioned it. I think George Galloway, was prone to the rhetorical flesh, as we know, said that Willie Ross was at one point the King of Scotland, which was an interesting sort of reflection. I think, I mean, and it's quite interesting that the Labour Party had the policy of home rule throughout the 50s and 60s, and it just existed as a kind of dead letter in the manifesto. And I think, obviously, the bit about how Blair was kind of notoriously sceptical about the prospects of Scottish and Welsh devolution in 97, but was forced into it because then they'd been elected, then it's become almost impossible for them to drop the policy as much as they wanted to. And I think that's quite interesting in terms of where the Labour Party is now. It's trying to defend devolution without ever really having a clear idea of where it's going. I mean, I think that's been kind of that's an ongoing story about the Scottish Labour Party, but I'm not really sure about what this Scottish constitutional question, what it really amounts to. Is devolution just kind of the final point of a process that goes back to sort of Keir Hardie and the formation of the Labour Party, or is it an ongoing process leading to further devolution or even independence?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think you're right that when you hear Labour Party politicians talking about devolution, they'll often say of themselves, I am the party of devolution, we represent devolution. And actually, if you go back through their history, and this is, I think the documentaries definitely showed this, it's a much more ambivalent and divided history in the Labour Party than that party of devolution tag really admits, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it certainly is true that in the Labour Party, well, the formation of the Labour Party in Scotland, Keir Hardie and so on, were home rulers. But the question is the extent to which that was, as I said, just a dead letter in the manifesto to sort of buck the vote up in Scotland, or whether it actually represented a sort of devolutionist impulse in the party. And obviously I'm sceptical about that. And I think, the sort of contortions of the party now, the sort of rampant, sort of unsophisticated unionism, which seems to be the default position that in too much of the Labour Party now, is kind of in a sense, a arrogation of that sort of history. And I think it's the sort of steps see Labour for Independence trying to reclaim that kind of idea of a scepticism towards unsophisticated unionism. But I think obviously it's not gone far enough, and you can see the extent to which that sort of unsophisticated unionism dominates Labour Party discourse today.
On a more general level, it's just nice to have the subject discussed, because we're not used to these kind of documentaries in our political viewing. But at a certain point as well, did it not seem you know, with the kind of stock footage and the people dancing and the tunes in the background, did it not seem a bit kind of I love the 60s, I love the 70s, I love the 80s at certain points? On a more serious note, I think, what do you think about the omission of Macron, the complete omission and non-mentioning of Macron, Andrew?
I didn't catch that. Didn't occur to me though. Obviously, it's a sort of fair point. It's one of these difficult ones politically, though. The Macron report. Now, I mean, in terms of the nationalists, I hope to use it now as an argument, because people have a very thin sort of memory, and the fact that Harold Wilson's government misled the Scottish people systematically and deliberately about oil to pursue their own constitutional agenda is terrifically interesting as a historical fact, but only really works politically now if you use it as a sort of resource to say, well, Albion is still perfidious. You can't really trust the British government to be straight with you about the oil reserves which currently exist, for example, in the North Sea. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think the documentary was quite scathing. It was the harshest part about the independence movement was the section on oil. I thought, I mean, they were quite sort of dismissive of the It's Scotland's Oil campaign back in the 80s. I think they were quite they tended to give the opinion that was a kind of sort of perfidious reactionary sort of selfishness. That word seemed to come up a lot, and it wasn't really challenged. This is the sort of selfish notion that the oil belongs to Scotland. And I mean, there was a couple of critical remarks, but I think that was kind of let slide in a kind of way that I think was a bit unhelpful about actually how the discourse in Scottish society has actually been much more serious about how we should use oil. It's not just been, you know, to keep all the oil so they can be rich and the English can be poor. It's actually much more about how to use the resources of the North Sea to actually develop Scottish society in a way in which sort of the London Parliament has failed to, and I think that could have gone into a bit more seriously.
Sorry, just another theme which came up throughout all two of the episodes you've seen, Michael, and I think to an extent the third one as well, was the Scottish cringe, and an argument that essentially it was receding, that Scots had become more confident, more comfortable, that, for example, it had Elaine C. Smith on saying that she'd never seen anyone with her accent on telly before. And through art and things like that, there was very much a sort of recognition of Glaswegian, particularly and around Glasgow, West Central Scotland, working class voices in Scottish public life. And one thing which I wondered about that, as somebody who doesn't really feel much of a cringe, but who has, you know, I have reasons why I'm not a member of the Glaswegian working class. I don't. My language is English, my first language, so I've never had any particular sense that I was being disciplined for using inappropriate language. And I wondered whether younger people perhaps are finding that this cringe, which our parents and grandparents identified as, it just has less purchase on us now, that it's not really something you'd think about. But I'm not quite sure. I wanted to ask both of you what you think about that. Do you think it's a question of age, or is it that the sort of cringe about Scotland is diminishing across all different categories of ages?
Well, it was a point that was made a few times during the programme that culture was ahead of the politics, and I thought I was quite happy that they put that scene with Paula Yates when she introduced the Proclaimers in it, because we'd mentioned that on a previous episode, and you could kind of see the disgust in her voice as she was saying, now this is a bit strange, I mean, I can't really believe this, but here's these two people, you know. But that kind of thing was a kind of cultural revolution in itself. Just to have people speaking and singing in their own accent has helped to diminish the cringe. Like when we had Stuart Braithwaite from Mogwai on, he was saying that, you know, if you were a kind of Scottish rock band now and you don't sing in your own accent, you will be ridiculed. But if you go back sort of 20, 30 years, everyone tried to do a kind of mid-Atlantic horrible sort of thing. And like, if you did that now, you'd be ridiculed.
What do you think, Callum?
I think, well, speaking as a kind of working class Glaswegian, I actually lived in London for most of the year. And I think there is still that element of a willful, what are you... I sometimes think people are trying not to understand what I'm saying. I think that seems to be still on the radar, unfortunately, especially among, I would say, I mean, London is a city of immigrants in itself, so there's not really... Everyone there, well, half the people there aren't even born in England, so there's not really that sense of... everyone has that sense of being sort of displaced in London, so I think it's different in London, but I think I would say my sense is it still exists to an extent that, an effort to speak properly, and, I think that definitely still exists.
To come back to the Macron thing just a little bit, interestingly, there was another documentary which did mention the Macron report and also mentioned Blair's redrawing of the maritime boundaries, which I think was possibly the first time I've seen those two things brought up in a programme of that nature, which was the Rory Bremner one. Did you catch that?
Yeah, Rory goes to Holyrood when he was sort of protesting ignorance about all things Scottish political. Yeah, I did see that. I mean, I must say the sort of whole maritime boundary thing is I think a bit of a red herring and something that nationalists get very, very het up about. I can see why, but the thing is, there's international law about boundaries of the sea, and yes, they are subject to negotiation, and yes, Blair's movement of that boundary, you can see, might be an argument for the rest of the UK after independence that sector ought to be considered in the negotiations as the kind of English rest of the UK sector and not a Scottish sector. But that's domestic law, it's not international law, and international law is the big question here. So I think for me, I'm not so convinced that it matters as much as many Scottish nationalists think it does, that particular question.
Callum, did you see the Bremner programme?
I didn't see it, no.
Okay. Okay, that's short.
His Alex Salmond impersonation wasn't very good. He somehow didn't quite, because it was all the way back of the throat like that, wasn't it? So it was sort of.
Yeah.
I've seen a few people actually trying to do the Alex. I think it's quite a difficult one for the impressionist to sort of nail down, because he's quite a. I think he speaks quite distinctively, but also quite plainly. I think it's quite a difficult one to get down properly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true, because he was doing the whole range of different folk, and he did a very good George Galloway and a very good Charlie Kennedy, and then just you had this sort of small, reedy voiced Salmond, which just didn't quite do it. I don't know why that is.
He wasn't very good at it, but I thought it was an interesting documentary, but I disagreed with the actual premise of it, that there is no satire. It depends where you want to look. Okay, there's been no satire about it maybe on the BBC or Channel 4, but that's because they haven't commissioned it. Like, if you want to go and look on the internet, then there's plenty of things you can find.
The thing about satire is, obviously, you have to know something about the subject in order to get the jokes. I mean, I think for a national British audience to do a programme on Scottish politics would kind of fly over their head, because most of them, either don't know anything or know so little that any of the jokes would be, totally lost on them, to be honest.
I thought that, talking of satire, my dear close personal friend Ian Davidson MP put in a marvellous performance, and marvellously strange performance on that Bremner documentary, where he said something to the effect of that Scots wouldn't want some stuck-up public schoolboy to come up north and tell them what's what, but they're happy for one of their own to make fun of them. He said, face like a dead fish, nary a twinkle of mirth in either eye. And you think, yeah, these are the bonny internationalists. One of our own. Charming thought, Mr. Davidson.
Yeah, and they don't want a public schoolboy telling them what to do, and this is the people that are in the Better Together campaign with David Cameron.
Yeah, I assume Ian Davidson was just he's a character act. I don't know.
Okay, and on the subject of Better Together and public schoolboys, someone came up to Edinburgh to tell us all what to think recently, and that was a Mr. William Hague, who made, I thought, quite an extraordinary speech, but not necessarily in a good way. I don't know what you thought about it, Andrew.
Yes, is William Hague a public schoolboy? He sounds. Maybe I'm just thinking because he's northern. So
no,
I think
famously not. He's a Yorkshireman, isn't he?
Yeah, no, there's no public schools in Yorkshire.
No.
I think he seems more like a kind of grammar school type, if anything. But yes, we lose all of our power and become and lose our might in the world stage and all that charming punching above our weight stuff. I must say, I think that the foreign policy argument for staying part of Britain is possibly one of the weakest aspects of the Better Together sort of argument, because you don't need a very long memory to cast your minds back to sort of the behaviour of the British state in a whole different range of spheres. And I know that diplomacy and international engagement is more complicated. It's not all Iraq, it's not all Afghanistan. But for good reasons, those loom very large. And I think I just don't like the sort of punching above the weight type rhetoric that you invariably get, because I'm not sure I want to join Britain in punching anybody.
As someone wrote, punching above their weight usually means that someone ends up getting punched. That's the problem.
Mm.
Callum?
Yeah, I think